Rebranding failure as a strategic pivot is still a retreat. You've done this before. A funnel stops converting, a traffic source dries up, a list stops opening what you send, and instead of asking what actually happened, you announce a change of direction. You call it streamlining. You call it doubling down on what works. What you're actually doing is rebranding failure as a strategic pivot, and the vocabulary is doing exactly what it's built to do, letting you move on without finding out what went wrong. The words matter because they determine whether the next thing you build inherits the same blind spot. Pivot implies you learned something specific and are applying it. Refocus implies a deliberate narrowing based on evidence. Both words describe a decision made from information. But if you can't say in one sentence exactly what failed and why, you didn't pivot, you left. The label came after the exit, not before it, and it exists to make the exit feel like it was planned. Rebranding failure as a strategic pivot skips the diagnosis. Here's what actually happens when a funnel or a traffic source stops working and you walk away without a real post-mortem. You don't know if the offer was wrong, the audience was wrong, the sequence was wrong, the traffic quality was wrong, or the timing was wrong. Any one of those has a different fix. Instead of isolating which one, you close the account, open a new one, and carry the same untested assumptions into it. The same sequence structure, the same audience read, the same offer logic, because none of those assumptions was ever named as a suspect. Calling the exit a pivot doesn't just soften how it feels. It actively prevents the question that would tell you what to do differently. The untested assumptions don't announce themselves when you carry them forward, which is what makes this pattern so easy to repeat. You build the new funnel with the same welcome sequence structure because it felt fine last time. Aim it at an audience defined the same loose way, because that's how you've always defined it. And price the offer using the same instinct that never got checked against actual buyer behavior. None of that was ever isolated as the reason the last thing stalled, so none of it gets rebuilt differently. The new funnel looks different on the surface. New name, new angle, new landing page, while running on the identical logic that quietly sank the one before it. This is different from genuinely deciding a channel isn't worth the effort relative to a better one. That's a real defensible pivot, and it happens after you know something you didn't know before you started. What's being described here is the opposite sequence. You feel the sting of another underperforming thing. You reach for softer language before the sting has a chance to turn into a question, and the softer language closes the loop before any diagnosis happens. The tell isn't that you moved on. The tell is that you can't say specifically why, beyond it wasn't working, which is a symptom, not a diagnosis. What changes once you name the failure? An honest pivot can survive being asked a direct question. What specifically stopped working, and how do you know? If the answer is concrete, the click-through rate was fine, but the page never named the offer. The traffic converted on one list, but not another because the entry point was different. The sequence worked until the point where the pitch showed up without groundwork. That's a diagnosis, and moving on from it is a pivot in the real sense. If the answer is a mood, it just stopped converting. The energy wasn't right. You wanted to focus on something more promising. There's no diagnosis underneath the decision, and nothing was actually learned before the exit. Naming the failure specifically doesn't cost you anything you haven't already spent. You already ran the funnel, sent the traffic, watched the list go quiet. The only additional step is sitting with what happened long enough to identify which single variable broke it, instead of retreating into a phrase that lets you skip that step. That short stretch of honest accounting is the difference between a pivot that carries a lesson forward and a retreat that carries the same untested assumption into the next attempt, dressed in new language. It also gives you something to check the next funnel against, a specific claim you can test, rather than a vague sense that this time will be different. The pattern doesn't stop on its own. Every time you're rebranding failure as a strategic pivot instead of running the autopsy, You're guaranteeing that whatever you build next inherits the exact gap that sank the last thing. You just won't see it until it fails the same way, under a different name, with a different vocabulary softening the landing. Before you announce the pivot, write down the one sentence that names what specifically failed and how you know. If you can't write that sentence, you haven't pivoted yet. You've just started the retreat. If you want to see what separates a real pivot from a retreat before you rebuild anything else, start here.